Okay, so we now have the software installed. Let's get to it, guys. So what we're going to do is open up our very own first project inside Unity, and I'm going to give you a bit of a walkthrough on the fundamentals of the workspace, the different panels, and how to create your first 3D objects. So as you can see across the top here, there is a button for New. So I want you to click on New. And here we can name our project. I'm just going to call it Workspace Demo. There we go. As that's what this is. And I'm going to use Unity 2019 as my Unity version. Now you can choose your own location to save your different projects, and we're going to use a 3D template, so everything else is fine. This is the name of my old account for Unity, so don't worry about the organizational side. And once you've got everything set up, simply click Create Project. Now while that's happening, let's minimize this for a second, as Unity will now boot up. Now your version using Personal Edition will look slightly lighter in color than mine, as I have a Pro license. The only real difference from your perspective is that the software will look slightly darker, and the panels and the background will be slightly darker in color than yours. So don't be thrown off if yours looks different to mine when it actually boots up. Okay, the software is now open. So this is how Unity looks. This fantastic 3D gaming engine. But what are we actually looking at? Well, like many other 3D softwares that are available, such as 3D modeling software like Blender and ZBrush or 3D Studio Max, what you will see in the center of the actual software is a 3D environment, and inside Unity this is actually called the scene. Now if you click inside, you can see that we have two elements. We have a camera and we have a directional light. And if you use your right mouse button and hold it down, you can actually pan around and see this 3D environment that Unity provides. If I want to scroll in or out, I can use the middle mouse button, or on a laptop you can use the touchpad to zoom in and out. Down at the bottom we've got the grid, which is used for referencing and working out the scale and position of different 3D models. And basically that's it for the overall look of what you're first presented with. Now if we go left to right initially, on the left hand side we have something called the hierarchy. And every basic scene comes with the foundation two objects, which is a main camera and a directional light. And if you click on these, you can select them the same way as clicking on them inside the actual scene. Everything that we add to the scene in the center will actually appear down the side in the hierarchy. And when you click on an object, that will activate the right hand panel, which is this way on the camera as it's flipped, and you will get what's called the inspector panel up here. That provides the properties and the information for the selected game object. Now if we look at the camera for a second, we get this funky little camera preview here of what you would see if this were actually playing in a game, and we can see at the minute look that this is the viewable area that the camera actually sees. And there are two different types of camera that we can use. This current one is a perspective camera, which will give things the true perspective of 3 dimensions and include things like distance. And the second one is something called an orthographic camera, which we'll look at later on. Now basically every 3D object has something called a transform, and that is an X, Y and Z position inside the 3D world, and that's represented by these three arrows. The Y arrow is the direction of up and down. Now if while the camera is selected you come across to the transform inside the inspector in the corner up here, we can see that we have the position, we have the rotation, and we have the scale of the selected object. Now if we look at the position inside this 3D world, the X, Y and Z are represented here with the transform, and if we want to manipulate these values, I can click and pull the camera and you will see the y-axis increase, like so. And that is effectively moving the camera up and down. Likewise, if I grab what's called the x-axis, it will move the camera left to right, and the z will move it forward and backwards. Now, it doesn't really show much or demonstrate much at the minute, but if we quickly create a 3D object by coming across to the hierarchy, and what I want you to do is right-click and choose a 3D object from the pop-up menu that appears. I want you to click on Cube, and we're going to create our first 3D cube. Now, okay, it's created a 3D cube for us, and you can see that this 3D cube also has an X, Y, and Z coordinate. Now, over on the right-hand side, you can see that the position isn't actually at the absolute center of the world. So what I want you to do is just click here and change these values to be 0, 0, and 0. The Z is the most important, as with the camera being positioned, if I just zoom around for a second, approximately 10 blocks back, that's why the camera is -10 on the position of the transform. The cube is at 0, and this is known as the absolute center of our 3D world. So if we want to have a look at this in perspective using the camera, we can now select the camera, and this box will appear in the camera preview at a distance of 10 away from us. So to show you how the perspective camera actually works, using the transform, I can click the Z axis, the blue one, or I can click up here and drag in between and pull this towards a cube, and watch what happens on the camera preview as the camera approaches. You can see the size of the cube is actually increasing in perspective based on the distance away from the camera. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this down a little bit so we get the camera to look at the cube in the center. Now, what I want to do next is actually select the cube and show you the second tool. Now, inside the transform, after position, we have rotation. Now, if we imagine these three axes as poles going directly through the side of this object, or directly from top to bottom of the object, or front to back, then you can imagine rotating on that pole as if we were twisting the pole going through. So if I got a hold of this red x-axis and actually turned it, it would effectively turn the cube this direction. So let's rotate on the X and watch how it manipulates the 3D object. I'm just going to click up here on the X symbol and pull my mouse. And you can see, look, that if I rotate backwards negatively, we're at -38, it will effectively rotate the cube as if we were twisting a pole that was going directly through this 3D object. And likewise, if I got a hold of the top pole and I turn the top pole, the y-axis, then if I rotate on the y, it will twist and turn the 3D object in that manner. Obviously, the scale options are self-explanatory, but if I wanted to increase on the X, it will increase in scale, on the Y, it will increase in height, and on the Z, it will increase in depth. Now, have a bit of a play with this, and don't worry if you mess it all up, because if you click on the cog in the corner, you can simply click reset and put everything back to normal, just like that. Okay, so how else can we create a 3D object? Well, the first thing that we did was we right-clicked to create the properties menu, and we could select a different type of 3D model. But across the top of the software, we also have the usual suspects inside software, such as File and Edit. And in Unity particularly, we have access to the same menu by clicking on the Game Object tab. So you can come down to 3D objects and create whatever else you want. And in this particular case, I'm going to create a capsule. Why not? So if I zoom out, there it is. You can see that it's not being centered once again, so I'll just reset that by clicking the cog. There we go, and you can see now that it's in the exact same location as the cube. Now the reason I'm doing this is because if I click off and I want to select the capsule again, if I click where the cube is, I will select the cube, and then I need to move this away to get a hold of the capsule, and it's a little bit tricky. So what you would normally do is click on the top or the side and select the particular object that you want, but I'll show you an easier way. If I want to select the cube, I can use the hierarchy on the left hand side and click the cube. I will then be presented with the transform for that particular game object, and I can manipulate the cube in whatever way I want, or I can drag around the different axes. If I wanted to click the capsule, then I can do the same thing. But what about when we have a few objects, such as we've created the absolute basics of a car, which could have a cube and a bunch of spheres for the wheels? Well, what you can do is something called nesting. If I just get rid of the capsule by right-clicking and deleting, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very, very primitive looking car, which will consist of a bunch of spheres for the wheels. So here we go. Let's get a sphere. I can't see it at the minute. I know it's behind the camera if I zoom out. There it is, look. But if we double click in the hierarchy, we can zoom straight to it. And I'm going to reset the positional transform to put it back into the center. Now, if I want these to be wheels, for example, very ugly looking wheels, but wheels nevertheless, you may want to bring these down. I'll move this across. There we go. I'll just increase the scale slightly on the X to make this a little bit wider. There we go. And have a bit of a play and move this around. I'm just using my left mouse button to select and my right mouse button to look around, just to position this in a very basic way of putting wheels as such. Now what I want to do is duplicate this game object and move it across. So if I right click, I can now duplicate rather than creating a new one and position it in the same way. There we go. I can now bring that across and we've got a couple of wheels. Now this particular car is only going to have 2 wheels just for the demo purposes. What I want to show you is how you can move all 3 objects at once, because what people like to do is simply highlight everything, which you can. You can see, look, we're having a problem grabbing the extra wheel. Sometimes it's picking it up and sometimes it's not. Look, it's covered. There we go. Now the smartest way to do this would actually be to nest the wheels inside the parent game object. So all you have to do is go to the hierarchy, click and drag them and drop them onto the cube, and they become children inside the cube game object. So if I click the sphere, drag it on top of the cube, there we go. We now have a cube with a couple of nested children inside. So if I were to click on the cube and move it, it will bring the children with it. Here we go, look, there you go. Now the downside is if you were to delete the cube, you would also delete all the child game objects. So I just want to show you 1 or 2 different ways of how we can use a hierarchy, what the inspector transform component is, and how you can actually use the tools to move things around. Now there's 1 third way of doing this as well. We can obviously select the items and use a transform, or we can use the tools up in the right hand corner. But the third and very common way of doing this is by using the menu system on the top left. And what these represent is just a visual representation of the different inspector transform components. So if we were on the first one, this would be the move object, and as you hover over it says move tool. If I go to the second item, this would be the rotation tool. This is for scaling. This is something called a rect tool, which we will use for things like buttons on the screen. And the fourth one is something that was brought out at the end of 2017.3, I think it was, in Unity, just before 2018 came out. And it's fantastic. It's called the multi-transform tool. Now, what I want to do is just click on each one quickly. If I click on the rotation tool, look, we can see that we get a sphere around, and we get these lines with different colors to represent the X, Y, and Z axis. It works exactly the same. If I were to click on the blue arrow here, which if I roll over, I know it's disappearing, but I'm making it flash so you guys can see it. But if I click and pull, then look, it will actually manipulate. Over on the right hand side, you can see the Z axis is being manipulated. And likewise, if I were to grab a hold of the red axis, it's moving on the X axis. So the rotation tool is just a visual representation, and it comes in handy when you've got complex objects later on. The scale tool obviously scales things, makes it bigger and smaller, and it's represented by a small cube in the center. To use it, you just simply click and drag, and things become bigger and smaller. And you guessed it, the multi-tool is a combination of all the other tools together. So what we get is the Move Tools transform, we get the sphere from the rotation tool, and in the center we also get the scaling tool. And you can choose whichever you want to hold. So if I wanted to move on the Z axis here, I can click the arrow from the Move transform and move it. I can click the blue line from the rotation. There we go. Or I can click on the scale tool and make things bigger. Now there is a way to actually, if I click on the scale tool, you don't have to click the center, you can just scale on a particular axis, like so. I'll just Command and Z or Control Z if you're on Windows to undo. And it's basically a case of just playing around with these primitive objects, understanding how you can nest objects inside another object, and when you click on an object, what the transform actually means and what it represents to what we can see on the scene. So what I want you to do is have a little bit of play. And this is a very terrible looking car, but what I want you to do is delete everything that was built, and I want you to create your own little 3D car using a cube, some spheres, or whatever you want, or maybe a train or whatever 3D object you want. The whole point is simply to understand how you can create game objects, or right click here and create game objects, and when you select the items, use the scale, rotation and positional tools on the right hand side or across the top or directly in the scene to actually understand the fundamentals of how the hierarchy works, as well as the inspector. Okay guys, have a little bit of fun, and I'll see you in the next video.